Okay, good morning everyone. It is a great honor and privilege to host a great scholar and a dear friend, Professor Jerzy Zdanowsky, who is a historian, Arabist, researcher and director of the Institute for Mediterranean and Oriental Cultures in the Polish Academy of Sciences, Warsaw. His research interests include the Arab world and the Middle Eastern history and culture studies. He teaches modern history of the Middle East, Orientalism, Christian-Muslim relations, modern Islamic thought, especially the Muslim Brothers, and developmental problems of the Arab world at the Jagiellonian University, the Krakow College, and the Warsaw University. He is also a visiting scholar at Kuwait University, Senior Fulbright Scholar, the School of Oriental and African Studies. He participated in Individual and Society in the Mediterranean Muslim World Program sponsored by the European Science Foundation. He has widely published articles and books and participated in numerous international conferences. His latest publications are the Manumit movement in the Gulf in the Farsi in the first half of the 20th century, published in Middle Eastern Studies in November 2011. And the Saudi Shia and political reform in Saudi Arabia, in political change in the Arab Gulf states, stuck in the transition, that was edited by Tetro, yes, and Okruhulik and Kacipiewski, published in Boulder, London Line and Line Reiner Publishers in 2011. Professor Zdanowsky has kindly agreed to talk about the right to Manumit and the empire, the British policy in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea in the 1930s, and we are eager to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Professor Shachvar, for this kind introduction. This is my second stay here in this so active and very prestigious center of the Persian Gulf Studies. By the way, the terminology is very important here, because last week I was in Tehran. I was giving a lecture at the Middle East Institute for Strategic Studies, and when talking about British-Persian relations in the 20th century, I omitted the Persian. So I simply told them the Gulf, and that provoked a large, very discussion, how you could omit this word. So was it purposely or not purposely?
Were you paid by the Arabs or not?
Yes, so generally my late project is about slavery in the Islamic world, and also the British policy on slavery. My project is based on the British sources, British documents. Several years ago, I found, it seems, a unique stuff of statesmen. So I found around 1,000 statesmen made by slaves. Made by slaves in the Persian Gulf, and the problem was that the British, as a colonial power, carried on the politics of manumitting people. So manumission was a great part of European culture, generally speaking, of the period of Enlightenment, to make people free and to condemn slavery. And the procedures implied by the Foreign Office obliged the British residents and agents all over the world to give a certificate of manumission to any person who applied for freedom. And the situation in the Persian Gulf was unique to that extent that the British agents at the agencies in Kuwait, in Bushehr, in Sharjah, in Manama, and in Muscat, they demanded from the applicants to produce a written statement about themselves. So as a result, we have at our disposal around 1,000 statements describing the history of enslavement, the history of being bought and sold, and then the reasons of running away from slavery. So that is a unique material, but today and I produce a book or the study Professor Shahvar mentioned. If you like, you can have a look at this article published on the slavery and the manumission movement in the Persian Gulf. But today I would like to stress the following problem. So slavery is a great topic in Islam. Slavery was accepted by Islam, and Islam provided very detailed rules concerning slavery, and in particular the duties of masters and the possibility of freeing people. So these rules can be found in Hadith. There is special part of Hadith concerning slavery. And at the same time, so the slavery was accepted by Islam, and the British, and also the French, but I am interested in the British policy, and the British entered the world of Islam with the special concept of slavery and the concept of abolition of slavery and the concept of manumitting people. So there was a kind of clash between two concepts, between the British European concept going back to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment as a important intellectual history and the concept of European culture, and at the same time the concept of slavery within Islam. And when we look at this problem from different levels, and especially from the level of everyday life of the British colonial administration and everyday life of slaves and slaves' masters, we can say, and that is my idea, my thesis of today's lecture, that manumission, and especially the right to manumit people, serve as an important political instrument, serve as an instrument of colonial politics, of imperial politics. Finally, we can say that there was a clash between a humanitarian approach to the question of slavery and political approach to this question. The starting point here is I picked up one event which happened in 1927. In this year, the public in Great Britain was shocked upon receiving news that 2 slave owners in Sierra Leone who recaptured runaway slaves were not prosecuted. it was 1927. So they were acquitted on the grounds that slavery was a lawful institution in this British protectorate. This judgment was delivered in spite of the fact that a century and a half earlier another famous case resulted in so-called famous in the British history Mansfield's judgment. William Murray, first Earl of Mansfield, lived in the 18th century, in the period of the Enlightenment, and he was a judge. And in 1772, he produced a famous judgment in the case of James Somerset, who was brought to England as a slave. So Mansfield held that there was no legal backing for slavery, and his judgment was the first was a precedence in this fact that a person entering British soil could not be considered a slave. And here in the British protectorate, two slave owners were not prosecuted. And this incident provoked a new campaign against slavery. So you see 1927, the trade in slave in England was abolished in 1807, and now there is 1927, and this problem is still very important. And this incident, as I already mentioned, provoked a new campaign against slavery. And in particular, several books, for example, the book of Lady Kathleen Simon, was published in 1928, and there were a lot of articles in the British press on slavery. And finally, some inquiries on the subject reached the Foreign Office. And finally, a discussion in the Parliament occurred on this problem. So what was the general idea? The general idea, let's say, this book of Lady Kathleen Simon entitled Slavery produced a picture that Arabia and also Abyssinia, they were worst offenders in the case of slavery. These books or some articles produce a picture of hundreds of thousands of people suffering from the most terrible sufferings. You know, it was depicted how people suffered. They were tied neck by neck. So very similar to these pictures known from the Hound of the Uncle Tom. About the Atlantic slavery in the 17th century. When the discussion reached the Parliament, the Foreign Office ordered some British representatives, especially in Jeddah, to produce reports on how the situation looked in fact. And several reports were produced with quite different picture. Let's say the agency in Jeddah prepared a report in which it was confirmed the slave market in Arabia became almost entirely confined to persons of long residence, and that the sale of Abyssinian girls was very rare, or that children of domicile slaves were offered for sale only occasionally. This problem, the question of the 1927 and 1928 discussion on slavery in the Great Britain is proof that the question of slavery and manumission and politics should be presented at different level. So the level of international politics is one level. But when we go down to the, let's say, the level of the ministers, the foreign office, and then we go down to the question, to the level of the colonial office, or then when we go down to the level of agencies of everyday, so the situation looked different. So the result, the conclusion might be that the question of slavery and manumission was exposed to all kinds of manipulation that was instrumentalized by some peoples, and especially it was exposed to the abolitionist societies. The abolitionist movement in the Europe, in the Western Europe, and especially in the Great Britain, is a great topic. That was a very active and politically involved movement. I mean, the abolitionist movement with different, with so prominent campaigners as William Wilberforce. And the abolitionist movement was based off a purely humanitarian basis, that slavery was an evil and it should be condemned and it should be eradicated. The general position of the abolitionist movement was to abolish slavery definitely and immediately. But when we look at the level of the British administration in the field, let's say at the level of everyday work of the agents in agencies in Bushehr, in Muscat, in Sharjah, in Manama, the situation looks quite different, because the British agents were of the opinion that immediate or definite abolishing of slavery means involvement in the local affairs, and they generally opted for gradual abolition. I would like to cite the report of the resident in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf. His name was Bisco. In 1930. He was the resident, so he was responsible for the Persian Gulf, and his position was that the abolition should be gradual. He hoped that once Arabia would be involved in global affairs and it would be traversed by aircrafts and visited by tourists, the slavery would cease to exist through natural means. I'm citing, literacy is spreading, and many of the sons of the present divers will be able to read and write, and will then be able to check their accounts and to ensure that they receive their just dues. So that was the concept of abolition, how to abolish slavery. And in the second part of my presentation, I would like to prove my thesis that the right to manumit was an important instrument of the British imperial policy in the Persian Gulf and in the Red Sea. My thesis is based on the British documents, and I would like to present to you this problem in the case of the relations with the Ibn Saud and with Persia. So the British exercised the right to manumit in the Hejaz, the western part of Arabia, when the Ibn Saud authority started to develop. The British exercised the right to Manumit in the Hejaz since the residency, the British residency at Jeddah, was established in 1872. On May 20, 1927, a treaty of friendship and good understanding based on a recognition of complete national and sovereign independence was signed between Ibn Saud and Sir Gilbert Clayton on behalf of the British government. And in the course of the negotiations leading up to sign this treaty, it was called the Treaty of Jeddah, Ibn Saud made it clear that he would not agree to the inclusion in the treaty of a provision recognizing the right of manumission by the British consular officers. So there was a growing feeling of sovereignty, of national sovereignty, of independency, and it turned out that the right to manumission contradict these growing sentiments. And how the British side reacted. From one hand, the British officers were under the pressure of the abolitionist societies, and the abolitionist societies opted for including the problem of the right of manumission to manumit people into this treaty. But on the other hand, there was politics, and it was not in the interest of the British side to include this this right to manumit to the treaty. And to make the story short, I can stress that the discussion between Foreign Office, Colonial Office, the agency in Jeddah, even the Admiralty and even the government of India, this centers of the British colonial policy in the region, was very was very tense, and many documents were produced on this subject. And finally, we can say that the political reasons took over the humanitarian reasons, humanitarian approach. And there was a memorandum prepared in which all aspects of the manumission were removed from this memorandum. The question of Persia is very interesting, because Persia, I want to attract your attention to three international agreements signed, and they concern the slavery. In 1882, there was an international convention, so-called the Brussels Act, the Brussels Acts. So the Brussels, the conference in Brussels in 1882 produced a document which was called the Anti-Slavery Convention. And this Anti-Slavery Convention regulated the question of slavery. That was a really a big international issue of international relations to, for example, to define slavery, what slavery was, and what about the forced labor, for example, and so on. A lot of very detailed problems of this. But generally, there was a convention on 1882. It was signed in still very colonial time, and this convention gave many colonial powers the right to manumit people, and this right in the question of the Persian Gulf provided, let's say, that the British vessels could stop Persian vessels on the high seas. On the high seas, not on the territorial waters, but on the high seas. So now we cannot imagine such a situation, right? We can imagine such a situation within territorial water only. In 1926, yes, you would like to ask? Yes, please.
Which countries took a part in this conference?
Sorry?
Which countries took a part in this conference?
That is a good question. So there were main powers at the time. So that is Germany, that was France, the Netherlands, and the UK, the leading powers. The United States participated in this conference, but they didn't sign this convention. But these leading, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, and Germany, they played the leading role. For example, Abyssinia was also taking part in this conference, but generally so-called the parties, and also Persia particularly participated in this conference, and so Persia signed the convention of 1882, Persia, but the relations between Persia and the UK, Great Britain, were regulated by special agreement signed the same year, a so-called Persian-British Treaty of 1882. And the second step is 1926. In 1926, a new anti-slavery convention was signed by the within the League of Nations. This was also a very long discussion, and finally the new convention was signed. So when the convention of 1926 was signed, Persia started to express the wish to be released from the Anglo-Persian Convention of 1882. Why? Because the Persian government considered that this convention, Anglo-British Convention on 1882, was derogatory to Persian dignity. So the same situation as with Ibn Saud on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, growing sense of national dignity and growing sense of independence. And at that moment I started to read a long series of documents, because this demand of the Persian government provoked a very interesting debate between Foreign Office, Colonial Office, India Office, Indian government, because the Persian Gulf in the colonial time was under the administration of the India government, and India government was subjected to a special ministry which was called the India Office. So when you are interested in documents on the Persian Gulf, you have to go to the archives of the India Office, but not to Colonial Office. So the discussion between these ministers was about should we release Persia from the Anglo-Persian Convention of 1882 or not? And the problem was purely of imperial dignity, I can say, because the number of people exposed to manumission according to this convention was very limited. practically slavery and trade in slavery in Persia did not exist. There were few cases of people being brought to Persia by the sea as slaves. So the question was of some principles, and this principle was the British imperial dignity. Let me cite the position of the political resident in the Gulf. This person who resided in Bushehr on the Persian Gulf, and he was responsible for the whole Persian Gulf. So his position was as it follows. We cannot trust Persia. If we give up at all, we shall by degrees lose our position altogether and become on equality with her. So that was the question of equality. The British did not imagine that the UK can be equal to Persia. So that the question of superiority and inferiority. With this situation and the hostile Persia, or one in alliance with a hostile country, our position will be an impossible one. And this position was supported by India government and the India office. But at the higher level, I mean the Foreign Office, the situation was taken more seriously, with more with consciousness. Finally, the situation was solved by the Persians, because the Persian parliament passed the bill forbidding all kinds of trade in slaves on the Persian territory, and it was on the 7th February 1929. So with the moment of the of this bill was accepted by the Persian parliament, some legal basis for the right to manumit kept by the British were removed at this moment. Summing up some conclusions. First of all, this question is a question. I mean, the question of slavery and manumission. The right to manumit people has two aspects: humanitarian and political. If we analyze it on the higher level, of course, the humanitarian aspects prevail. But at the level of everyday life of British administration and British agents and residents, situation is literally different, because the political aspects of everyday contacts with the local powers prevail in this situation. It is striking that the number of people applying for freedom to the British agency was very small. My calculation made in this article says that in the period between 1903 and 1949, because the last statement I found in the archives goes back to 1949. So in this period, probably these are estimates, probably 1% of slaves, maximum 2% in some years, maximum 2% of slaves applied for manumission. So that was really striking, and that was a kind also that was an embarrassing situation for the British agents in the field, because they were blamed by the abolitionist movement in London and also by the Foreign Office that why the number of application is so small. probably you have not advertised this, you have not displayed well this, so put more efforts because we provide the room for freedom. So situation was paradoxical because from the point of view of abolitionists in London, in that sense that people could get the freedom, but they prefer to stay in slavery, right? But anyway, I can say that the efforts of the British were very positive in limiting the slavery. Let's say the role of the British ships in preventing smuggling people from Abyssinia in 1920s and 1930s. That was a rather complicated mechanism of sending sloops to patrol the waters, the question of cooperation with Italy, with France, so quite a complex situation. And when we, last sentences, when we look at the situation in the Gulf, I can say that the right to manumit people played a kind of preventive role as a measure of discouraging slave owning. The certificate of manumission, because every slave got the certificate of manumission in Arabic and in English, the certificate of manumission was a guarantee for the good treatment of slaves for those who lived within reach of a British agency at the least. And in the course of time it became universally known throughout the Gulf that the British authorities did grant manumission to any slave applying for it, and there was no doubt that the large majority of the slaves could escape to them and obtain freedom if they so desired. So thank you very much, and I hope I didn't take your time too long. So
no, that was great. Yes. Thank you very much. The floor is open now to questions. Yes, please, Ariel.
You were talking about this policy, so I still can't understand what was the British motive. I mean, didn't they have enough to deal with in this period of time?
Yes. The motives were intellectual and humanitarian, and that was it was a sequence of developments, intellectual developments in Europe itself, in European culture, because on particular time of the European history, slavery was described as, I am citing, as the scandal of the civilized world. And it was at the beginning of the 18th century, in 1807, when the British Parliament outlawed the participation in the slave trade. So the process of another approach to slavery started in Europe, in European culture, in European civilization, and of course it took time to eradicate the slavery in the at the least in the British Empire territories, because in 1807, when the Parliament outlawed the participation in the slave trade, British slavers had probably shipped more than 2.5 million captive Africans to the Americans. So the slavery, the trade was still going on, but in some intellectual development of the European civilization concluded and judged this phenomenon as a crime or as a scandal. so the activities on anti-slavery activities, we can say, were a result of a compromise between intellectual approach and purely political and commercial interest. By the way, it is well known that the adoption of 1807 Act, that was a very critical point in the intellectual history of UK and Europe. If you are in London, you can find the monument, the so-called the Buxton monument near the Parliament, commemorating the 1807 Act. So, as I told you, that was a compromise between thought, especially this Enlightenment thought, and commercial interest. It's worth of to say that the Act of 1807 was adopted at the moment when the Caribbean territories, British territory, stopped to play so critical role in the economic development of Britain. So that is my answer. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Mahmoud Yazbak, please.
At least I want to continue on this point that you have finished here. I haven't been at the beginning, but I could understand toward the end. I'm looking, the largest merchants that we ever have for slaves at this period are Europeans and Americans. And some of the slaves are in the Middle East, but most of the slaves are in America and in Europe. So here we have a kind of manifest telling us that in the Middle East, it's how to put it, it's not nice to have slaves, but you don't have the same standard of criticism towards slavery in the United States. How could you explain that? How could we explain that? That means now when we're looking back on it, I could say, if I'm using a term, modern term, that we are talking about double standards, and even at that time, by looking at the Middle East and in the United States, in America at that time. So, am I right in my point in looking by comparing it? Because if you look at the Middle East as only one area, things will look different. But if we make the comparison between Middle East and America and putting Europe at the middle, maybe we'll have a different picture about
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, for this question, but my opinion is quite different than yours, because I can say that the Middle Eastern slavery has not been enough exposed in the literature and not in the history of slavery. If you go, let's say, to any museum on slavery, let's say Liverpool, there is a beautiful, excellently prepared in the former docks, the Museum of Slavery. Nothing about Islamic world, nothing. Slavery is the slavery in America. This is the trade between Africa and Americas. And I talked to some experts in America on these experts in the, let's say, Professor Sean Marmon from Princeton, on the an expert in Islamic world and the slavery in Islamic world. The opinion is that also the research on slavery has been dominated by so-called American paradigm, that slavery is a slavery between Africa and America. It could be proved by the number of, judging by the number of research, of studies, and also this question of museums. As far as I know, there is no any museum on slavery in any Arab country. There is a new idea to establish a museum on slavery in Qatar, very new idea. I met 2 months ago, I met a person, a Sudanese researcher who lived in America, and he was asked by the Qatar authorities to help them to make a project on the museum on slavery. But and it seems to me that slavery in the Persian, sorry?
Local slavery or American?
No, the local slavery, local slavery. But the idea is to expose only the part of slavery, the slavery in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, slavery understood as employment of divers for the pearl diving, pearl industry. But nothing about so-called domestic slavery, because the Arab world is, especially the Arabian Peninsula, was a region of different kind of slavery, mostly domestic slavery, and not so much industrial slavery as in the Eastern Africa or in America, right? So, but in fact, the Persian Gulf was something different, because divers employed in the pearl diving, the majority of them, or the good part of them, they were slaves. But slavery, so-called, for example, in the Persian Gulf and in Arabian Peninsula, even industrial slavery was a very different kind and rather strange for classical approach to slavery. Let's say we cannot imagine in America a slave who lived on his own,
Yes.
in his own house. And there were cases
Even of villages of slaves.
even villages, right? And the documents prove, let's say, that some slaves on the Arabian shore, they own their own slaves, you know, and they own, let's say, boats, and they went so far as Zanzibar or the Red Sea. They made commerce, and after coming back to the Persian Gulf, they share the profits with their masters.
So there's a question of definition. What is a slave?
There is a question of definition. What is the slavery?
How many years a slave would become a slave in the Middle East, comparing it to the United States and America, for example? In America, somebody who becomes a slave, he will be a slave all his life. But usually, as we know, I'm asking that the slave is not committed to be slave all his life. So usually, what we have after 6 to 7 years, people are have their freedom.
Yes, their freedom, right? Yes, I agree with you. And there was in Islam, there is a concept. There was a concept of freeing people, let's say, before going to Mecca to perform Hajj, or before the death. That was a good deed to free a person. So and also there was the possibility that a slave could purchase his or her freedom, to pay some money and to get freedom. That is the fundamental question, what slavery meant in these societies. And once I was asked that by someone who didn't see any difference between free people and slaves in the Persian Gulf in this period. But there was, however, there was a point which divided free people and slaves, because slaves could be sold and bought anytime. And that was the main reason why the slaves were running away from slavery. They were afraid of being sold or bought, and they were afraid of being separated from their families. That was the main reason why people were running away from slavery. It wasn't the economic situation, because sometimes it was very funny when a slave reported to the British agency, and shortly his owner or her owner, because there were women also running away from slavery, but shortly his or her owner reported to this agency, and the British agent generally could not distinguish who was a slave and who was an owner, because sometimes they both have brown skin, and they clothes were the same. They looked poor as both, because that was a very poor society with existing in a very difficult ecological situation. But referring to your main question, of course there is a psychological approach to this, and I understand that in America that was a very painful process to understand this phenomenon, which was very cruel to comparing with the Arab world, of course.
Actually, European travelers that have traveled also to America and to the Middle East, like Lady Shale. She was the sister of the British ambassador in Iran in the 1850s. She writes that the situation of slaves in Iran are by far better than that of America, and they are much, in a way, freer than the attitude towards them is much more humane, yes, than America. Iran, you want?
Thanks. First of all, thank you for this illuminating topic that I agree with you is really under-researched in the Middle East. But I have to question British role in this issue. Yeah, you keep referring it as a colonial power, and when we talk about Arabian Peninsula, and you're not talking about Persian Gulf, excluding Iran, Iraq, I don't think that the British were really a colonial power. I think they wanted to dictate thing, but they didn't really do it. They have agents, but not more than this. And I think also when we talk about the slave trade, they had minimal effect on this trade, and especially on abolishing it. And we have to see it as an economic process more than political, military, etc. The highest of the trade was, of course, in the Omani Said period in the 19th century, and it was declining in the 20th century. And effectively, the period that you are talking about, the 20s and 30s, the big depression all around the world, and especially in this region, when the pearl industry collapsed because of the invention of the culturized pearls, etc., etc. So slaves were really not as important, and trade declined considerably. So the trade in slaves declined considerably, and it stopped. Of course, it took several years, several decades to this phenomena to disappear. But the British had, as far as I can see it, really very minimal role in this process.
Yes, I agree with you, Dr. Segal. The problem is that the Persian Gulf was a part of a long chain of strategic interests and tactical approaches, and it was marginal to some extent in the British imperial policy, because as far as we perfectly know that India was the main object, and but the protection of routes leading to India was also very important. And before the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamian River were considered as a very possible shortest way to India. There were several attempts in the 40s on the 18th century to put the navigation on the Euphrates and the Tigris. Chesney, yes. There was some attempts, and a small steamer was sent to the north of Mesopotamia. So it wasn't the principal object of the British policy, but it was important in the whole strategy. And I can agree with you that the British didn't interfere in the affairs of hinterland. So from this point of view, they were not a colonial power, but they were very sensitive to the sea. And if something...
were they controlled?
Yes, they were very sensitive. They were very sensitive because of the Russian attempts to enter the Persian Gulf, German attempts and French attempts to enter the Omani affairs. And when any...
Sensitive, yes, but did they have effect?
Effect? There were facts, because they destroyed many towns on the Arabian coast of the sheikhs involved into the piratical activities. They destroyed, the first attempt was they destroyed Ras Al Khaimah in 1819. So they suppressed any piratical activities on the sea, and they were really very tough and determined to keep the peace on the sea. So from this point of view, I could argue with you about this colonial rule or not. Trade is very trade in a slave practically was stopped in 1870s when the British employed ships, sloops, and protected Zanzibar. So the exportation from the Zanzibar was stopped in 1870s, and as a result, the trade in slaves diminished in the Persian Gulf since then. But it doesn't mean that the slavery stopped to be an important part of the local social system. It was. And when the importation of men was stopped, the problem of reproduction appeared. And it was very important how to reproduce the slave communities. And shortly speaking, how to provide slave men with women to establish new families. By the way, that was a duty of an owner, according to Islamic norms, to provide a slave woman or a slave woman with a partner. That was the duty of the owner. And some slaves running away from slavery to the British, they complained that their owners failed to provide them with a partner. So that was in other words, these people, I mean slaves, they consider that their owners broke down the rules of this situation. And in the 20s and the 30s, you mentioned, these days we observe a new phenomenon: importation of slave women from Mekran, from Persia, from Balochistan, Pakistan, Makran. So that is Persian Balochistan, right? So importation of women to provide the local slave men with women to reproduce the families. And of course, the depression in the 20s and the 30s was an important fact. You mentioned the depression, economic depression. And it influences the local slave community to much extent. But I found some studies on this phenomenon, and particularly the idea that the economic depression in the 20s and the 30s provoked people, slave people, to run away from their masters. My impression is on the contrary, that the depression put slaves much more stronger to their masters, because there was nowhere to run away. So they kept with their master on, and only in very dramatic situation people made decision to run away. This decision was when the owners were not able to provide slaves with all kind of food and clothes, and they started to cash in them. They wanted to sell some of them to Arabia, to Hijaz, to Sampa, and that moment provoked some people to run away and reported the British agencies. But thank you for this question. This is really very complex, a lot of questions here. Yeah, thank you.
If I may, you talked about that we have about 1 to 2% of
yes.
the statements of
yes.
the total number
of
the
total
slaves.
number, yes, of course,
And,
estimates, because we cannot calculate very precisely.
I've created some kind of idea, but I just wanted first to ask you, those who wrote the statements, usually we can assume that the people who actually were slaves, they were illiterate.
Yes, right.
So
yeah.
how come they wrote of it? So could we assume, and this will solve maybe the 1 to 2%, that 1 to 2% were literate and they could actually write their own statements?
No.
So if not, then it means that somebody else wrote it. And it means it brings us to the question, who wrote those, and whether it was a truthful or not truthful. So it opens up the whole idea
yes, the whole idea, yes. of how primary these sources are. I was thinking about
authentic,
this, yes.
how authentic the information is.
They are authentic. They are.
No, I mean authentic
yes.
in terms of they say they're telling the truth. Really, I mean the respect.
Yes, but here.
Or maybe
yes,
it was
yes.
it was more for to say to those abolitionists that we are doing some activity here, you know. So I mean,
yes,
this
yes.
whole opens up a whole thing.
No, yes. Thank you, Professor Szachwar. This is interesting topic. By the way, I should confess that in the course of my research on slavery, I enslaved a person.
Okay.
Yes, that was my daughter, Natalia, and I enslaved her, and we read all together this 1,000 statements.
Okay.
Yes, but in the course of then she stopped to be manageable, and she escaped from slavery to study economics in Valencia, so very far distance from Warsaw. But generally we read all these statements, and the procedures were very precise. If someone wanted to get the certificate, he or she must report at the particular agency. If he was a subject of Persian state, he was refused to get to obtain. He was sent to the Persian Gulf. Even Arab slave reported in Bushach or Bandar Abbas, he was sent back to the Arabian coast. So the British didn't want to interfere in the hinterland, interfere in the Persian. Yes. And because their goal was to prevent the peace on the seas. So that was the main object.
We are talking actually on those 1,000 people. There were 1,000 slaves that were caught on the seas?
No, they reported at the British agencies. Okay. Yes. So there was no way from the beginning of the 20th century to 1949, there was no way to get a certificate of manumission without reporting to a British agency and without producing a statement. That was the procedure. So when a slave reported at an agency, he or she was asked to tell his life story. And that was a helper to a British agent. Generally, it was a Indian from the special service, Indian service. That was an Indian who knew Arabic and English, and he wrote down this oral statement.
Okay.
So, of course, we see some routine or in these questionnaires, because first of all the name and where you were born. So there was a procedure how to ask these people, but inevitably, and we are not sure 100% whether this helper wrote down the story of this person.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was no reason why he should distort this story.
Okay.
There was no reason, you know. So in this case, we can say that they were illiterate, of course, but their statements were written down by the helper to the agent. And then the whole story, the statement with the some report of the agent, let's say in Kuwait, Bahrain, Sharjah or Muscat, there were 4 agencies. This dossier was sent to Bushach,
the resident.
The resident. And if there was something suspicious in these statements, the case was sent back to the agency for further investigation.
Okay.
Why? Because some slaves invented their stories. And it's interesting that they were free people playing slaves. Because of the debts.
Okay.
There was a rule that a slave could not ask for credits because it was his or her master responsible for financial situation. But in some cases, traders gave money to slaves, hoping for its recovery from their owners. But generally there was a rule that a slave was not responsible for the debts. So free people indebted much, they played a slave to get the permission and to avoid paying money. So there were many, they were thieves also, running from their masters with some goods and something, and they played. So the story was interesting, and it was under thorough investigation by the resident. But the general idea was that the British policy was that no one could be prevented from obtaining the certificate of freedom. Let's say if turned out that that was a thief, nevertheless he or she, because there were also women thieves or prostitutes, let's say, slaves, so she or he was granting the certificate of freedom, and only then he was transmitted to the local Qadi to be punished for his or her crime.
I have another question regarding sources. You definitely have covered the British sources. The question is whether there are any, the question of slaves have been tackled by the local governments, whether in the pre-state situation or in the post-state issue. I mean, there's any chronicles, any archives, or any local sources that actually you have found or you intend, you think that there is something. I mean, you came naturally. You came in contact with a lot of scholars from local Gulf area.
Yes, that is interesting.
That would be an immense contribution to the research if there is such sources.
Yes, that is. This is.
Well, I don't know, because on the Arabian side, at least on the Persian side, there might be something, because there was a Iranian state and they held the archives. On the Arabian side would be probably chronicles, maybe, because there was no state situation, but
No one really referred.
No, really refer. Yes, and there are very few chronicles. Abderrazik on Kuwait, but rather early 20th century, and let's say these chronicles of Ibn Bishr and Ibn Hunaym of the Wahhabis.
what about the Ottoman archives, for example?
Maybe, but Ottomans, the Ottomans, they didn't have any agencies
No.
besides
In
Basra.
certain parts, yes,
Basra. I
yes.
think that Basra could be promising.
It's good to look at
But
it.
the question is on the Arabian side that, let's say, when a Qadi was called to a house because a dying person wanted to manumit his or her person, there was a written statement made by the Qadi. It was produced and it was given to the owner. But as far as I know, such cases were not registered by the Qadi's registers, in the Qadi's register. So I don't think that it is possible. Of course, if you search, maybe you can find something.
There is no
But I had.
for Qadis
Yeah,
like
well,
in
as I said, in the
Yes,
Arabian
yeah.
side, no,
But
I
on
would-
the Persian,
Iranian
yes,
side, it would be
yes,
good to
probably
consult.
to the local municipalities.
Yes, I mean there was a good
Bandar Abbas.
track for example, for the prostitutes. They are not
Yeah.
published yet, the sources, but there are a good track of that. I would assume that if there is any transaction of money with slaves anywhere, so as far as it's money concerned, there should be some kind of tracking. So
Yes,
it would be a good thing to look at.
Good thing to
And,
look at, but
yes.
you need to visit probably several places on the Persian Gulf, right? Or the
Well, it will be
Central-
probably
Central
National
Archive.
Archives. Yeah,
National
I think
Archives in Tehran. Yes.
I would try that.
Yes.
I mean, I would propose that you try that. I wish I could.
But the problem, Soli, is that the language.
No, well, you can,
Yes, because
through,
inevitably these local archives were produced in Farsi.
but local
but
assistance.
The diplomatic sources I was informed in Tehran, the diplomatic correspondence was produced in French. In the
Some,
20,
some.
concerning, let's say, British-Persian negotiations.
Agreements usually in French. Yes. But I mean text in
Text
Persian.
in Persian.
Yes.
But I had an idea of investigating what happened with these slaves. What were their fates? What did they do after obtaining the certificate? And of course, there is nothing about this in the archives, because the certificate was granted and the case was done.
There's
Right?
no need to come back
Yes,
to the agency.
but let's say if you go to some places of the Arabian shore, or especially Oman, in Oman cities, there is a big portion of black skin or brown skin
Yes,
people,
that's right.
including even some emirs of the Kuwaiti family. So I think that to collect idea of collecting oral tradition would be very promising. But the problem is that this question is quite sensitive. When I was in Oman, I was invited to give a lecture. The great mosque, Sultan Qaboos Mosque. I proposed to my friend in Omani to talk about slavery. Yes, and shortly after that was my mistake, because he told me, no way, if you want to talk on slavery, don't come to Oman, because we are at the stage of building up nation, and everywhere you have in Oman, we are building up Omani nation. So in this term to mention something which can split the society is not appreciated. So it is a difficult project to realize. And once I was in Abu Dhabi, I was giving a lecture, and I knew that the question of slavery was not acceptable. But nevertheless, at the end of the question, I mentioned about my research, and that I have already collected 1,000 names of people with some characteristic of them. And after the lecture, several girls, students, approached me, inevitably of African origins, because of brown skin, and privately they asked me to check their family names on this database. So that was very rewarding moment in my research. Yes.
Yes, Dr.
I think if there is some place to make some comparison with the French attitude toward slavery, especially in Mauritania, another part of the Arab world, because in Mauritania they know the slavery was the most stubborn phenomenon until I suppose last years, and it was under the French rule for a long time. What you know about it? Because this is a different, not British, but the French, with all these ideals of French, of the civilization and so on, and enlightenment, and this was the French territory with very, very strong basis for slavery for a long time, along the 20th century.
I thank you for this question, because it makes the story wider. Frankly speaking, I didn't pay attention to Mauritania, but to Morocco, and because Morocco is very important in the British documents. The Great Britain successfully entered Morocco at the beginning of the 18th century, and the relations between Morocco and Britain was quite developed. And but going back to your question, I understood that you pointed out the relations between the colonial power and their agents and the local society, and especially slave society. So if we think about this and we think about mixing between colonial administrators, so I haven't found any documents on the fact that the British agent got married, let's say, with a slave woman, which happened quite often with the French colonizers. They intermix with a local population, and especially slaves. There are some memoirs and of ex-French colonizer administrator who got married with the local women. Here I haven't found this, but it would be interesting. The French archives on slavery are kept in Nantes. Nantes was very important port of importation, slave importation. It would be fine, an excellent idea to compare this attitude. Thank you. And also, I would like to know more about the French politics in manumission, problem of manumission.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zdanowsky, for honoring us with a very interesting topic, which I'm sure that there is a tip of the ice, and you have still a lot of work to do on this. And I'm sure all the things like this article and the book that you published last year, was it? The Green Book?
The Green Book,
yes.
yes.
There are major contribution to this topic, very important topic of the Middle East. So thank you very much.
So thank you, and thank you, Professor Shachvar, for the invitation. It is a great pleasure always to come to Israel and to Haifa. And I want to thank you for coming and for your patience to listen for so long speech, my speech, and I wish you to many successes in better understanding of the Arab world and generally the problems of this part of region. So all the best to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.